really excited about tonight's meeting because I think that we have taken on a wonderful, wonderful project. It's going to be under the leadership of Drew McKay and Barbara Vaughn and several other people, which you'll hear more about later. But before we can talk about the Nassau School, which is the school that we would like to preserve, it would be good to hear about the 80 schools that DuPont was responsible for building so that black children in Delaware back in the 1920s could have at least a minimally decent place in which to get an education, since Delaware legislation wasn't about to provide that. And so I, for one, commend Pierre Dupont for taking on this project. But we have an expert. I'm not the expert. We have this wonderful speaker, Sylvester Woolford, who did not send me his resume, so I can't tell you much about him, except that he is the commissioner with the Delaware Heritage Commission. He is the chair of the DuPont School Preservation Group, and he is a member of the Historical Affairs Organization. And I just had lunch with him and dinner with him and Jim Abbott from the Lewis Historical Society. And as you know me, I'm usually a woman that says a lot. I did not get a chance to say one word. Those two men talked nonstop about history that went back as far as you can go back, and it was just amazing the breadth of knowledge that these two men had and shared with me, their only audience at lunchtime. So with that, let me introduce Sylvester, Mr. Woolford. And you'll have a chance to ask questions and to comment after his presentation.
It's good to see this incredible crowd. It's good to be in Sussex County, and it's good to see my Delaware State alumni. It's good to get down here and see. I was the class of '65. It's good to see some of these folks are still alive, but that's okay. You keep living, keep moving. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. I myself attended a DuPont school, and I had my father and my two aunts both taught at DuPont school, so I have an incredible and vested interest in preserving the history of the DuPont schools. But we have to talk about the segregated institutions, and we have to talk about how we got rid of segregation, and we have to go through the whole process. So I'm going to give you not only the DuPont schools, but the entire history of where we were in 1920. And hopefully I can, at the end of this, tell you how far we've come, or at least tell you how far we have to go. Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was a Creole. He was down in New Orleans, Louisiana. And the Jim Crow laws were getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And Plessy Ferguson was trying to get the Creoles, who spoke French primarily, identified as white, so they didn't have to ride in the Jim Crow cars. The Supreme Court, first of all, told Homer Plessy, even though you have only 1/8 African American blood in you, you were still black. And in addition to that, you have to ride the Jim Crow cars. This gave us in 1896 separate but equal. And this became the law of the land up until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So beginning again with this Plessy versus Ferguson decision, we got segregated schools, segregated restrooms, segregated waiting rooms, segregated bus terminals. Any way they could segregate us, they segregated us. This is a map of the United States. The red states are mandatory segregated education. Whether you want to be integrated or go to a white school or not, in those red states, it's against the law, for blacks and whites to go to school together. In the other states, again, most of it's optional, or in some instances they did have integrated schools, or in some instances they said you could do whatever you want to do. Delaware, again, is a red state. So Delaware had mandatory segregated schools. During this period of time, which are the late 1800s, early 1900s, the leader of the African American community was Booker T. Washington. Before him, it was Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass was trying to get African Americans first-class citizenship and their civil rights and the right to vote, etc. Booker T. Washington had a different philosophy. He was a segregationist. He believed in the separation of races. He was a black man who believed in the separation of races. And in 1895, he came up with what became known as the Atlantic Compromise. And the Atlantic Compromise said that in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, and yet one as the hand in all things essential to social justice. The white community stood up and applauded. Said, this is great, we got a black guy who believes in separating the races. So again, this is support for segregation and Jim Crow. Booker T. Washington was funded by philanthropists. They thought it was a good idea to separate the races, and he was the black spokesman for that. And such a notable philanthropist as Andrew Carnegie supported Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee Institute. And Robert Ogden was a partner with John Wanamaker, the department store Wanamaker. And these folks, again, went to Tuskegee and supported what Booker T. Washington was doing. And this is Tuskegee Institute in 1899, which was 2,267 acres of land. They believed not in academic education, but in vocational education. All the schools were built by the students. Not only did they build the school, they made the bricks. So the students made the bricks, they built the buildings, they grew the food that they ate, they cooked the food that they ate, they took care of the farm animals. Here again, we're talking vocational education. Booker T. Washington said if you could be a school teacher or a bricklayer, be a bricklayer, because bricklayers do more for the community. We again have to think through whether he was right or wrong, but at least it gets us to the point of thinking about what he was talking about. Here again, he is with Ogden and with Carnegie and with Taft, who would be president. So Booker T. Washington was talking to the wealthy and the famous and the powerful. Into this environment came Julius Rosenwald. And Rosenwald is not a common name, but it should be a common name, and perhaps when you leave tonight it'll be more common. Julius Rosenwald was the chairman of the board of Sears Roebuck. And he invented the Sears catalog, for those of us who are old enough to remember the Sears catalog. So Julius Rosenwald was the Amazon.com of his day. And he made lots and lots and lots and lots of money doing that. And he decided to give the money back, or give it to the community. And he looked at what Booker T. Washington was doing and said, you know, I should help Booker T. Washington, because he looks like he's doing something positive and something he should do. So he joined in with Andrew Carnegie and John Wanamaker and Ogden, and he started pumping hundreds of thousands of dollars into Tuskegee Institute. The two of them decided maybe we should do something else. Maybe we should build schools all over the South to help African Americans in rural communities. And so Julius Rosenwald built 5,557 schools for African Americans all over the South. By 1940, 30% of every African Americans who attended the school attended a Rosenwald school. An incredible accomplishment, and again, he should be more recognized and more celebrated for, again, the contribution that he made to the African American community. Into this environment came Pierre Dupont. So Pierre Dupont wasn't the first guy. We want to give him all the credit he deserves, but shouldn't give him more credit that he deserves. He wasn't the first guy to think of building schools for African Americans. But Delaware was a DuPont state, okay? And so we have no Rosenwald schools, we have DuPont schools. DuPont was chairman of the board of the General Motors Company and president of the DuPont Company. And he resigned those two positions to become the first Secretary of Education of the state of Delaware. Delaware was an agricultural state, and for whites and blacks, school was not mandatory. You didn't have to go to school at all. The farmers would say the sun comes up, you feed the chickens, you slop the hogs, you milk the cows. What do you need school for? And so the first thing that P.S. Dupont did was make 8th grade education mandatory. He then went out and surveyed the schools that existed, and there were 400 schools in the state of Delaware, black schools and white schools. And out of 400 schools, only 8 of them were, as he put it, up to standard or inhabitable. So they had almost 400 schools that they knew they had to rebuild. He wanted to set up a system like we have today. You pay property taxes, school taxes to take care of building the schools. But in the process of getting his bill passed or the legislation passed, the legislature said, okay, we will fund black schools and white schools the same in public education. We will have mandatory education, but we're not going to pay for rebuilding all the black schools. P.S. Dupont then said, okay, I will take $6 million out of my own pocket to build the black schools. So this, again, is the commitment that he made up front as other folks were figuring out whether they were or were not going to pay property taxes. This is what the schools look like. Most of them, again, were one-room schoolhouses with outhouses, no indoor plumbing, very little circulation or ventilation. And so this is the condition in which African-American kids had to try to learn. Dr. Bradley Skelcher, retired assistant provost at Delaware State University, wrote this book called African-American Education in Delaware, History Through Photographs, where he shows photographs of the African-American schools which P.S. Dupont had taken pictures of, and basically shows this deplorable condition in which education for African Americans existed. This is a newspaper article from the Baltimore American, which again, even in its day, talked about the great things P.S. Dupont was doing. We're talking, this was done in bits and pieces, but this is the first $300,000. To spend $300 for Negro schools, this was incredible. This was a historic event. Delaware will use some of the DuPont money for this purpose. And the article goes on to talk about the immediate construction of 26 schools and $300,000. And many of these are one-room schoolhouses all over the state of Delaware. You recognize some of these states, some of these cities, Cheswell, Claymont, Concord, Dover, Georgetown. These are the communities. And many of them didn't have schools before, but these were, again, for their day, state-of-the-art, one-room, two-room schoolhouses. There was more money, again, set aside to build white schools. So here we see a $300 million that was set aside for other construction. This is the Christiana School, and that's the way it existed when it was built. That's a two-room schoolhouse. It's still in the hands of a nonprofit, so it is trying to be preserved up in the Christiana area. The Iron Hill School 112C, built in 1923. That has been preserved and turned into a museum. It was once the home of the Academy of Natural Sciences, and they have built a building behind it, so it has been totally dedicated to preserving the history of one-room schoolhouses and the DuPont schools. This is the Hockessin School up in Hockessin, Delaware. And again, some of the schools are better than others, are made out of brick instead of wood. But here you have a two-room schoolhouse up in Hockessin. This is the Newark School, which is a four-room schoolhouse, and where I spent the first 5 years of my education. So that's again, it is a building that still exists today and is still in use as a city community center for being rent out for different purposes. This is the Buttonwood School, and there is my father, Sylvester Woolford Sr., standing next to Mr. Matthew Colburn. And again, most of the teachers of the day of this period were men. And especially where there were 2 or 3 rooms, the principal was normally a male. Today in kindergarten or 1 through 8, we have a tough time finding a male teacher, and especially a black male teacher. In this area, in this era of history, many of the teachers were black. The school teachers were black men. The school day started off with singing the Dupont song. This is a picture of Buttonwood School and Mr. Colburn at the piano. Again, the teachers had all kinds of skills. They were music teachers, they were math teachers, they again taught all subjects, and sometimes they would have 8 different classes in a room, and they had to teach them all at the same time. They had, again, incredible skills. And the DuPont School song, the DuPont song was, there are 2 men in Delaware of whom the state feels proud. One gave us schools, one gave us road. Let's sound the names aloud. So we, again, celebrate DuPont now, and we celebrated him again during the early 1900s. The Buttonwood School, again, has been turned into a museum. It has been refurbished at incredible expense. The number is somewhere around $250,000, if you want to put a number on it. But it was almost, the roof was leaking, and it had a couple fires, et cetera, and Tom Gordon, as one county exec, put a lot of time and money into it, as well as Jean and Teal Petty that you see there. This is a cabinet which shows you the original bell of the school. So when the school day started, they used to go out and ring the bell. So that's a historic bell of the Buttonwood School. And these are the kind of artifacts which should be in all 85 schools. This is groundbreaking for the Iron Hill School. And there you see the politicians. You see Tom Gordon there, who was county exec. And the Iron Hill School was not only Iron Hill School, but it was the Natural Academy of Sciences. And Tom Gordon put $1 million, it was a $1 million grant to preserve natural sciences as well as to preserve this one-room schoolhouse. Many of the schools, again, all the schools were named 112C, 110C, 15C, 201C. But in the 1940s, some of them got renamed after African-American historic figures. The school in Belvedere, which is the Newport area, was named after Absalom Jones. So it became the Absalom Jones College School, Absalom Jones being the first African-American Episcopal priest. These, again, are some pictures which should preserve this period of history. These are the African-American faculty members of Absalom Jones in 1950 and 1951. These are some of the students at Absalom Jones. This is May Day. For those of us who are real old, we remember that May Day was probably the only holiday we ever celebrated in the school. We got off for Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter, but May Day we were in the school, and we had maypoles and we had marbles, and it was the greatest day ever in the school. And these are some young ladies who dressed up to celebrate May Day, which was a great event. Some of these schools still have alumni associated with them, and some of them have been closed for 50 or 60 years. So when I say alumni, I mean these folks are 80 and 90 years old. And it's very important that we preserve this history, because I don't want to put bad luck on these people, but I don't think they will be around that much longer. the Delaware City School, 118C, where these folks had said they haven't been together a long, long time, and they came out in their wheelchairs just to have a reunion of the Delaware City Colored School. And again, these are the types of articles and records we need to identify these folks and to preserve this experience. Again, we're not talking about John D. Rockefeller, but these are our folks. This is our history, and we should write it down and we should preserve it. And this is an article that talks about the experience of those who attended the Delaware City School. We're now going to Booker T. Washington, and Booker T. Washington was in Dover. And this is a gentleman who met his wife at the Booker T. Washington School, obviously many years ago. And so the article, again, talks about his experience. This is an old picture, 1940, of children attending the Booker T. Washington School. It was renovated and, again, has been turned into a elementary school. They did take the time to put an exhibit or a trophy case or whatever outside, which explains that this was a DuPont school. It's its original purpose. So again, this is an incredible contribution to the African American community that they just didn't tear it down or just didn't forget about it. If you go to the Booker T. Washington School in Dover, you will see an exhibit of it being a P.S. DuPont school and some of the students who attended there. Rabbits Ferry, and we get down here and we talk about cities up in Newcastle County. We don't know where Slaughter Neck or Rabbits Ferry are, but we're sure you folks do down here. This is the Rabbits Ferry, which is putting up a historic marker. And again, we should make sure that these 85 schools of P.S. DuPont have historic markers so we remember where they were. And this is a picture of the Jackson family that took up most of the school. But here you see the Jackson family on their way to school. And again, many of these schools were taught one-room schoolhouses, so I think the Jackson family in this instance took up the whole school. But here again, we have the opportunity to celebrate the existence of this school and put up a historic marker so that generations to come will know what the purpose of the school is. And this dedication gave them the opportunity to remember the contribution that the school made in their life and to tell their story about the school and how it was going to be used in this case as a community center. So they use it as a community center and they have meetings there. And again, this was the dedication ceremony. So again, we encourage you again to visit Rabbits Ferry and look at what they've done to their school. The school's in incredible condition after, now we're talking 100 years. In Bridgeville, again, this is named after a famous historic figure. Phyllis Wheatley was an African-American poet. She was born a slave, and she was the first woman, black or white, to have a book of poetry published. So this school is named after her. And this picture's at the Delaware Public Archives. This is Paul Laurence Dunbar. So this is in Laurel, where the school was named after Paul Laurence Dunbar, and this is the basketball team at Paul Laurence Dunbar. We come to Jane Huffington, if Jane wants to raise her hand. And we want to keep as many of these DuPont schools in the community's hands so we can preserve this history and have some place to put it. So Jane has taken on the challenge of preserving the Richard Allen School, and there is Jack Markell, and along the way we have to thank a lot of folks, P.S. DuPont and Jack Markell, for helping us preserve this history. There's the historic marker at the Richard Allen School. There's the Richard Allen School. This is a celebration. And again, we should celebrate. And we should thank the folks who, again, are working on this project and working to preserve the history. And again, we want to thank all these folks who are taking on the challenge of preserving the Richard Allen School and continue to celebrate in whatever manner they can, African American history. These are some of the folks, again, who attended the school, and they are given certificates for having attended and being part of the history. And this, again, is Jane passing out some of those certificates, and these are, again, are some of the folks who are part of the families of these communities, and again, the dedication of the historic marker. This is the Ingram family who, for generations, again, went to that school. We've covered the 1- and 2-room schoolhouses, the more rural schoolhouses. Pierre Dupont only built one high school in the state of Delaware. What that meant was if you lived in Lewis, or you lived in Seaford, or you lived in Dover, and you wanted a 12th grade education, you had to move to Wilmington, or at least find somebody with a bus or a car who would take you there every day. So there were a lot of folks who had to move to Wilmington to get a 12th grade education. Howard High School, when it was opened in 1928, was the best high school for African Americans in the country. It cost $1 million to build in 1928. The school was just renovated, and it cost $100 million to renovate, and it didn't show up in the newspaper. That's actually because we don't have a newspaper up in Wilmington, but that's a different story. Okay. But you can, again, do the comparison there. $1 million in 1928 and $100 million didn't make the newspaper. But this was a truly state-of-the-art school. These are some of the pictures before it had opened. And this is just an incredible school. It was set up to handle 500, 600 students. Again, in 1928, this is the auditorium that sat 500 people. Just a massive auditorium for those of us who have seen it. This is the stage of the auditorium where you could put gymnastics equipment, or you could put a basketball team or whatever. And so again, you see how much supplies and works went into this. This was, again, a state-of-the-art facility with all the best equipment. These are some of the classrooms. And as you can see, these are talking gigantic classrooms, some seating upwards of 70 kids in one classroom. This is the chemistry lab, and this is the cafeteria. And again, we have to think back and say, we're still talking a segregated society. We're still talking separate but equal. This didn't change until 1954. This is an incredible contribution which DuPont made to the African American community. We again get into vocational education, not only academics, math, and reading, etc., but we're talking beauty parlors were there, and barber shops were there. This is a washroom. You can wash your clothes and iron your clothes. A sewing room for teaching sewing. This is the 1930 faculty of Howard High School. This is the first graduating class of Howard High School, which is 1929. So this is the first class that graduated from Howard. These are some other pictures of kids working on something they're constructing. This is kids on the baseball field. This is ladies in sewing. So these are some of the classes that are going on. This is the shop class. This is the auditorium. And we always go back to sports, and we somehow always remember high schools for the sports team rather than the academic teams. But this was the 1962 Howard High School 4x400 relay team, which won the national championship at Penn Relays. And whenever they talk about Howard, that's the first thing anybody ever says. They don't say P.S. DuPont, they say track team, 1962. So we always celebrate our sports heroes. This is the 1953 graduating class of Howard High School, which still gets together today. Again, some of these friendships are family relationships and long-term relationships, and that's really what this is about. It is about family. You tell the story of family. So these are folks who have met every year since 1953 and consider each other family. We then get to 1950, and obviously it took a lot of thinking, but the legislature of Delaware said, why don't we build some high schools below the canal? So they decided in 1950, or they were opened in 1950, to open up 3 additional high schools, who were the Eagles, the Rams, and the Pioneers. The Eagles were Lewis L. Redding High School, the Rams were William Henry High School, and the Pioneers were William Jason High School. So these were 3 new schools, Lewis L. Redding, and we won't talk about what was going on when schools were going on, but we know how to party, so these are some of the parties we had of the alumni who went there, who still know how to celebrate. This is their 2017 celebration. They still got their sweatshirts from the school. Pierre Dupont, or Lewis L. Redding, did go back and see the school that is named in his honor. And there he is at the Lewis L. Redding School. These are some pictures from the 4th grade at the school. And these are folks who are celebrating. There is Don Blakey, former state representative Don Blakey, helping the folks in Middletown to celebrate. Whatever we do, we should take time to celebrate. So these are folks celebrating with balloons, with food, with more food, with some old pictures, and we should again celebrate our history and talk about again our friends that we made in many instances, in this instance for a lifetime. They again within this year actually put up a historic marker for the Lewis L. Redding School. This is the Lewis L. Redding Comprehensive High School in Middletown. William Henry. William Henry, this is an old picture from William Henry. This is the faculty of William Henry. This is the historic marker for William Henry High School. These are some folks who still celebrate William Henry High School. So they are celebrating. And this is an alumni association still in existence for William Henry that stood out in front of the school, which is now William Henry Junior High School. But nonetheless, they still go and celebrate. The Pioneers. I was about to say, can we get some? So, we have some pioneers. Okay. William Jason Comprehensive High School. And when we talk about William Jason, we can't forget George Parks. Because George Parks won the state championship in the broad jump, and we always remember him and his trophies, and we always remember his jacket, which says William C. Jason Comprehensive High School, 1950 to 1967. So we can applaud, an extra applause for George Parks. An extra applause for our historian or memorabilia person for William Jason. We need historians and memorabilia folks because we need to preserve this history. And again, there are still reunions and celebrations that are going on. I understand they don't bowl anymore, but that's okay. We don't have to bowl, we can get together and eat food. And this is another article talking about, again, William Jason High School. And these are some pictures from 1952, the graduating class and the 9th grade class at William Jason. Again, these are things that we have to preserve, and some of them are at the Delaware Public Archives, some of them we have in our house, and somehow we have to collect these things and make sure that no one forgets. The white farmers were the 4-H clubs, and here we have the New Farmers of America, which were the African American farmers. In 1967, William Jason, William Henry, Lewis L. Redding, Howard High School had all shut down. We were, again, in the period of integration. And so as of 67, there were no segregated elementary schools or high schools in the state of Delaware. We have to go through the process, which sometimes becomes painful, of saying, okay, what happened to the DuPont schools and how did African Americans get an education after the DuPont schools? Well, some of these DuPont schools, in terms of themselves, were turned into senior centers, were refurbished to still be in use today. Many of them have been neglected and torn down. Many of them we're still working on restoring and are going to get it done. It'll take time, but we're still working on that. But let's take a look at what happened after the DuPont schools, after we went through the integration process. Here we see two old guys hugging, and we said, what is this picture of? Well, the question that is being asked is, what was the first school to integrate in the state of Delaware? And we probably would talk about Brown versus Board of Education or whatever. We should talk about Salesianum. We should talk about the Catholic schools. In 1950, Salesianum decided to integrate, and there were 5 African American black guys who integrated the school on November 14, 1950. And these are 2 gentlemen who were in that class, and they were hugging each other. This is a reunion which took place in 2018, so this is 68 years old. They're probably holding each other up, but that's okay too. That's okay too. But 68 years before this, they weren't hugging, so it took them 68 years to hug each other. So Salesianum was the first school to integrate, and again, after 68 years, we can all hug each other. Lewis L. Redding was the first, and for about 25 years, the only African American lawyer in the state of Delaware. He, along with the NAACP, decided that African Americans were getting an inferior education. So he asked folks to tell him, stories about the lack of quality education for their kids. And out of those stories, he selected 2 cases. One being Bulah versus Gephardt, the other being Belton versus Gephardt. Bulah versus Gephardt was a young lady who attended the Hockessin College School, and Belton versus Gephardt was a lady who attended Howard High School but had to walk or be driven from Claymont, Delaware, down to Howard High School. So these are the cases that Lewis L. Redding took, and he won his cases. Surprising to him and surprising to everybody else. In 1952, he won these 2 cases to say that these 2 young ladies were not getting the quality education of their white counterparts. The state of Delaware decided that since it lost the case, that it had no choice but to have those 2 young ladies integrate into the Hockessin School and into the Claymont School, but it told everybody to hold off on integrating the other schools because they were going to appeal and they were going to go to the Supreme Court, and it was going to be part of Brown versus Board of Education. There was one school that wouldn't wait. Arden didn't wait for the Supreme Court. This is a story from Newcastle County, which is long story. I will try to make it short. There were some folks up in Newcastle County who were communist, socialist, communal people. And they set up a commune in Arden, Delaware, which is south of Claymont. And they shared food, they shared housing, they shared everything. And they had a school. And when the state of Delaware decided that there were 2 schools that were going to integrate, they said, well, why don't we integrate why don't we integrate too? And they said, well, the state of Delaware told us we shouldn't integrate. And they said, well, we're communists. We don't listen to the state government anyway. So they integrated also. And this is a historic picture. And it doesn't look like a historic picture. It's black kids and white kids on a sliding board. But you have to live through it to appreciate it. But this, again, in 1952, is showing you black kids and white kids on a sliding pool board, which from that period of time was epic. So this is an article on it. After the two schools in Delaware integrated, then we ended up with NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and we ended up with the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And school heads took it for assumed end state segregation. So we went through the process, and again, this becomes a painful process, but process nonetheless of determining which schools would be integrated and what the process would be. This is a picture of Linda Brown. All of these cases got consolidated together. There were actually 5 cases under Brown versus Board of Education. Linda Brown was alphabetically the first one, so when we continue to consolidate these classes alphabetically, Brown became the first in the alphabet. And so the case became known as Linda Brown, and there is Linda Brown. And it was Linda Brown versus Board of Education, and there were actually several other plaintiffs. There were 6 other plaintiffs who were suing the Board of Education in Kansas. This is also a historic picture because the 5 cases were in South Carolina, Washington, D.C., Delaware, Kansas, and so the plaintiffs never got in one room, but this is a picture of all of the plaintiffs in one room, including Linda Brown. This is a lady from Seaford who talked about integrating Seaford Elementary School at gunpoint, which was interesting, and that her daughter had gone back and was now the administrator at Seaford Elementary School. So we do see progress. This is a picture or a story better known by a painting of Norman Rockwell. This is Ruby Bridges. This is on the left-hand side, it's the actual picture, and on the right-hand side, it's the Norman Rockwell painting, which shows a young 6-year-old girl being escorted by U.S. Marshals into a elementary school in New Orleans, Louisiana. And again, her name was Ruby Bridges. This again is the painting by Norman Rockwell. There is now a statue to Ruby Bridges. There is a Ruby Bridges Foundation. And these are pictures of Ruby Bridges actually attending school at the school where she integrated. This is Ruby Bridges 40, 50 years later holding hands with one of the U.S. Marshals, and that escorted her into that classroom that day. And there she is next to her statue. And again, she needs some presidential recognition for the risk that she took integrating the school. And this took place in 1960. And normally we look back and say, well, it wasn't that much of a big deal. But let me tell you, it was a big deal. And it was so big a deal that 3 years later, 2 little girls coming out of Sunday school were killed by the Ku Klux Klan. So these were a very hostile time in African American history, and not as easy as it looked. We then come to Delaware. And again, as someone said, well, Delaware's a northern state, isn't it? Well, Delaware's a friendly state, isn't it? Well, we all get along, don't we? Somehow in 1954, we didn't all get along. A gentleman came over and made trouble for us. And gave Milford the name, the town that surrendered to hate. Milford tried to integrate schools in 1954, and Brian Bowles, who you see there, came over and created disturbances and delayed the integration process by at least 10 years. And this is an article that talks about the chaos that occurred in Milford over 3 or 4 weeks, or Orlando Camp, again, has written a book on that, which is called The Milford 11, which describes his experience in trying to integrate the schools in Milford in 1954. The most significant case we have in attempts to integrate the schools during this period of time was the Little Rock Nine. We're trying to integrate Little Rock High School. And there was tremendous opposition, and the governor of Arkansas, again, wouldn't support integration. And Eisenhower was president of the United States. And so Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne. And federal troops should not have military action in a state unless you declare war. So Eisenhower had to get on TV and explain why he sent the 101st Airborne into Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is a famous historic quote: "Local authority has broken down." He said, as soon as we restore local authority, then I'll let the governor come back and run the state, and I'll take the U.S. the 101st Airborne out. And again, this is what it took to go through this process of integration in the United States. These kids, again, Ruby Bridges was 6 years old. Many of the folks at Little Rock High School were 16 and 17 years old. This is an autobiography of Melba Beals. And our autobiography is called "Warriors Don't Cry." And it's tough not to cry when folks are throwing rocks at you and calling your name, and you're surrounded by folks with bayonets, but somehow you get to write a book called "Warriors Don't Cry." There are other stories which at a future date we can talk about, but many of the universities had obstacles in trying to integrate. University of Alabama, historic, University of Georgia, Texas, Mississippi. And again, those stories should not be lost. They are part of our history and something we should remember and hopefully never repeat. We'd like again to thank Pierre Dupont for the schools that he built, Julius Rosenwald for the schools that he built. We'd like to thank Louis L. Reddy for giving us the institutions that we have today. And I would like to thank Charlotte for inviting me and allowing me to give this presentation today. Let me give you a mic.
There's a mic in the center. If you get, while we're waiting for Mr. Duffy. As you can see, we have quite a task before us. And I think the major message that you gave us in that wonderful presentation is that we have history to preserve. And that is our goal in looking at the Nassau School, or the Nassau College School, as it was known. And it will take all of us and a commitment to preserve the history of the people in the Lewis and surrounding areas. So look forward to you joining us, Mr. Duffy. And thank you again. That was a wonderful place. You can imagine what my children was like.
My name is Pierre Dupont. I'd like to commend on that fine presentation. I noticed during the presentation you mentioned there was one high school built in Delaware during this period, but there were two. One was at Delaware State. University is still present, and that I am one of the last graduating classes of that school in 1950.
Let me ask for your apology. Frequently, Delaware State gets left out in some history written because folks said you had to pay, and it was a boarding school, and there were a lot of differences between Howard High School and Delaware State. But Delaware State actually had a DuPont school on campus, as well as providing the 12th grade education. you for the history lesson.
If anyone has questions, if you come to the mic in the center, if you have comments, or if you have a commitment that you're ready to make. We welcome you to come to the microphone. And here comes someone.
Well, I live on Dupont Avenue. So there is a Dupont school, but I'm really not sure about the history of that school in Lewis. So I didn't know if you could tell me something about that.
Really can. Again, we're talking the Nassau School that we know was in the Lewis area.
And that's right on Route 1 and 9.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's now Fred's Thomas building now, but we called it Dupont School because and the street that I live on is Dupont. So I wasn't sure about the history of
I did
that.
some research today. It turns out they built 33 schools in Sussex County.
Can you use the mic? Use the mic. Use the mic.
I think I'm loud. I said the little research I did today, they built 33 DuPont schools in Sussex County. And the school that Trina's referring to, which is near or is the OSHA school that some of you go to, is one of those schools.
Always great to see a Delaware State alumni, just one for the Hornets.
Yeah, he and our classmate, the Hornets, and congratulations for a wonderful presentation. My name is Stella Parker Selby. My father went to that DuPont school here in Lewis, where Trina's speaking of. Several African Americans did. Prior to the Richard Allen movement, my uncle went to Richard Allen. It's a long story. Sussex County has a story to tell, and we are trying to preserve it. Thanks to Charlotte and the group. I haven't got that much from the mic tonight. But anyway, I would like for all of us who went to the 1-2 schools who are here tonight to stand so folks can see that the history is in the room.
There are wonderful.
There's 5 of us here tonight, and we have a story to tell.
One of the things that Mr. Woolford had mentioned is part of the history in whatever is built here comes from your artifacts, comes from your stories, comes from what's in your home. And this is going to be a long process because one of the things we have to do, and I heard you say it a number of times for us to hear, we have to collect a lot of information. We have to talk to the people who went to those schools, and we hopefully have to talk to the people who taught in those schools. And the first meeting that we had on the school, there were 2 women there who had taught in the Nassau school. So that for those of you, I know some folks have said, well, since that last meeting, Charlotte, what's happened? We haven't heard anything. It's going to be a long process, especially if you listen to all the things that you said must go into it. I also heard you say something for me which was very important. We have to preserve that history. It is part of our local history. Any other questions? Comments? You mean you're all going home early? Yeah. Well, I thank you very much. I thank you all for coming out. I want to really thank Mr. Woolford. It was a wonderful, wonderful program.